Okay, so now that we've seen both the for loop and while loop, as well as nested loops in action and understand how they work, I want to introduce 3 new keywords that come in useful when working with loops. Now first of all, we'll look at the keywords break and continue. Now in Python, break and continue statements can alter the flow of a normal loop. So rather than just having a loop iterate over a code block until the test expression is false, we may sometimes want to terminate the current iteration or even the whole loop without checking the test expression. And it's the break and continue statements that are used in these cases. So let's see an example of how we can use the break statement. So the break statement terminates the loop containing the break keyword. Now this means that the program will go to the statement immediately after the body of the loop. So for example, if I were to type for num in and then put a list of 10 integers from 1 to 10, in the body of this for loop, if I were to then type if num equals 4 and then put a colon, I'll then put the break keyword. After this if statement, I will then print num. Now after this for loop in its entirety, I will then print the sentence, this is code after the for loop. So what do you think will happen here? Well, on the first iteration of this sequence, we will store 1 in the variable called num. We will then check the statement to see if num is equal to 4. Now because num is not equal to 4 because it contains 1, we will not execute the subsequent code, i.e. the break statement. But what we will do is we will print out what is stored in num, so we'll print out 1. We'll then go back up to the for loop and iterate to the next item in the sequence, which will store 2. 2 is not equal to 4, so we don't execute the break statement and we'll print 2. We will also print 3, but on the 4th iteration, num equals 4. So when we check to see if num equals 4, this condition will evaluate to true and the break statement is executed. Now this means that we break out of the loop and we will no longer iterate through the sequence. But what we will do is skip to the statement immediately after the body of the loop, which we can see is print this is code after the for loop. So what we should expect to see is 1, 2, 3, and then this is code after the for loop. When we run this code, you can see we do indeed bring back 1, 2, 3, and then the sentence this is code after the for loop. So when you include the break keyword inside of a loop, it breaks out of the loop in its entirety if the condition is met. Now if the break statement is inside of a nested loop like we saw in the prior video, the break statement will terminate the innermost loop, i.e. the loop that the break keyword is put within. So for example, if I put for num in range 1 to 4, we know this range will contain 3 numbers. Inside of this for loop, we'll put another for loop. So we'll put for letter in the string kingdom, then if letter equals D, then break. Otherwise, print the letter, and then in the main for loop, we'll print 2 dashes. So what do you think this code will print out? Well, let's think about it. The first time the for loop is run, we store 1 in the variable num. We then check each letter in kingdom. So if k equals D, then break, but because this evaluates to false, we'll end up printing the letter K. We'll then iterate over the nested for loop a second time, so I does not equal D, so we'll print I, we'll then print N, and then we'll print G. Now on the 5th iteration, D is stored in letter, so letter will equal D, so it evaluates to true, and then we will break out. We will then print the 2 dashes in the main for loop, and we go back to the main for loop because we've now broken out of our inner for loop. So now num will contain 2, and we now go through the inner loop again. So what do we expect to see? Well, we expect to see K-I-N-G, and then on the 5th iteration, letter will equal D, and we will break out of the inner for loop. We then print 2 dashes. Now because range has 3 numbers, we'll actually see this occur again, so when we run this code, you can see we print king with 2 dashes, king with 2 dashes, and then king with 2 dashes, and the break keyword breaks us out of the nested for loop but takes us back to the main for loop. So the break statement allows us to terminate the loop that the break statement resides within. Okay, so now onto the continue statement. Now the continue statement is used to skip the rest of the code inside a loop for the current iteration only. Now saying it out loud may sound confusing, so let's get straight into an example. So if we put for num in and then a list of 10 integers, we can then put a colon, and inside of this for loop we'll first check to see if num is equal to 4. We'll then put a colon. Inside of this conditional statement we're going to put the keyword continue. Now in the main for loop we'll then print the num if the above conditional statement evaluates to false. And then after this for loop in its entirety, we will just print this is code after the for loop. So you can see here that when I run this code, we first of all print 1, because 1 is initially stored in num doesn't equal 4, so it evaluates to false, and therefore we print 1. We then move on to the second iteration of the for loop, so we then print 2, and we then print 3. Now when we store 4 on the 4th iteration in the variable called num does now equal 4, so it evaluates to true. We then execute the continue statement, and what this will do is it will skip the rest of the code inside this for loop, in other words print num, and we'll go back to the for loop but on the 5th iteration. So you can see that we actually skip the number 4 because we skip that iteration only. We then go to 5 doesn't equal 4, so continue isn't executed, and we print 5. We then go all the way to the end of the list and we print out 10, and then we print out this is code after the for loop. So the continue keyword for that iteration moves us back to the for loop, and it does not execute the statements after the continue keyword. So let's see another example to make sure we understand. If I put for letter in string and then a colon, if I check to see if letter is the same as R, if it is, we will continue, otherwise if it's not, we'll print the letter. We will then just print this is code after the for loop to show when the for loop has completed. So we first of all print S, we then print T. When R is stored in the variable letter, the if statement now evaluates to true, and we continue. In other words, we skip over the rest of the statement, so we don't print the letter R. I is then stored in letter on the next iteration, I doesn't equal R, and we therefore print out the letter I. We go back, we print out the letter N and G, and then finally we print this is code after the for loop. So because the letter R equaled R, we continued, we didn't print out that letter, and the loop continues as normal. So a useful way of being able to continue through a loop and getting the computer to skip the rest of the code inside of a loop for the current iteration that it's on. Now finally we have the keyword pass. Now this is very simple to grasp. Now in Python programming, the pass statement is a null statement. In other words, nothing happens when you put the pass keyword. Now the difference between a comment and a pass statement in Python is that while the interpreter ignores a comment entirely, which we know is created by using a hash symbol, pass is not ignored, but nothing happens. So why would this be useful? Well, we can essentially see the pass keyword as a placeholder. So suppose we have a loop or a function that is not implemented yet, but we want to implement it in the future. Now they cannot have an empty body. The interpreter would actually give you an error if we don't put something. So we use the pass statement to construct a body that does nothing. So for example, if I put for I in and then a list of integers from 1 to 5, and then I put a colon and then return, you can see that when I try to run this statement, we get a syntax error telling us that there is an unexpected EOF, in other words an unexpected end of file, while passing. But let's say we don't know what we want to contain in the body of this for loop, but we do know we want the for loop to begin with for I in this list of integers. We can simply put the keyword pass. When I now run this code, we do not run into an error, so we can continue as usual. So 3 new keywords that I've introduced you to. We have the break keyword that will enable you to break out of the loop in its entirety. We have the continue keyword, which will enable you to skip over the subsequent statements of a for loop for the current iteration only. And then we have the pass keyword, which can be used as a placeholder if you don't know what to include in your for loop's code body. Try using them in different scenarios to ensure you understand how they operate.